Hey, everybody, welcome in. It is the Utopia Football Podcast on a Tuesday. Just got done with the first session of mandatory minicamp today. Had eyes on that. A lot of media members out at that. Practically full attendance for the Texans. Anybody who wasn't out there at practice for the Texans had an excused absence. So a lot to get into from the minicamps, and we've got a mailbag to get into as well. So let's get right to it. Let's start off with the administrative stuff. A reminder, do this at the beginning and the end of each episode, to subscribe to the podcast if you're finding it, if you enjoy it, most importantly, but you haven't subscribed yet. What are you waiting for? Please do subscribe, tell a friend, give us a rating and a review as well. That always helps with engagement and whatnot. So subscribe, rate, review. And as I mentioned, we'll be doing a mailbag a little later on in this episode in about, probably 10 or 15 minutes, answer a few of your questions. HOU mailbag at gmail.com. HOU mailbag at gmail.com. If you want to email anything to the show, feedback, questions, comments, insults, whatever the case may be, HOU mailbag at gmail.com. So let's get right into it. Texans minicamp takeaways from today. So just to level set where we are right now on the NFL calendar, this is the last week that the Texans have anything off-season related. I don't count training camp as part of the off-season. To me, the off-season is from the time the Super Bowl ends through the last mandatory minicamp, the last thing to occur before a little vacation and then some training camp action. So they've got, I think they're scheduled for 3 practices this week. What usually happens with minicamp is that they practice twice, and then the team normally gives the last practice off. So that's what I expect to happen because they're working so hard. So that'll be the media will be able to watch tomorrow's. I will not be at tomorrow's. So these are my observations from today, Tuesday's minicamp. And then the players will be off after this week for about 5 weeks. And then the Texans and the Bears will both start their training camp at least a week before everybody else because they are playing in the Hall of Fame game. So it's going to be a short turnaround. Training camp will be here before we know it for the Texans. So as far as observations go from minicamp today, aside from just the fact that my overriding observation with all this is just how surreal and wild it is, considering that 2 years ago, I was at a mini camp where Davis Mills is the anointed starting quarterback, and the wide receivers are Chris Conley, and the running back is Rex Burkhead, and everything else, just all the horribleness that went along with the Texans for 2021 and 2022. To be at a mini camp where Stefon Diggs is running around, Joe Mixon is carrying the football, and Danielle Hunter is crushing pockets is just a really surreal thing. And that energy, maybe there's a chicken and egg thing going on, that because those names are out there, I feel more energy, or maybe just it seems like there's more energy. And oh, by the way, these big names are out here, but this feels like an NFL mini camp is my first just overriding takeaway really from the entire offseason is just what an incredible job this team has done in shifting things around with the talent level, the culture, the vibe. And I guess that leads into the first. I've got really 5 observations from today. And the first one is CJ Stroud. This is going to sound like I'm stating the obvious. He's the unquestioned leader of this team. And what I mean by that is we already knew he was the leader of the team by virtue of his being the quarterback, him being a good quarterback, and the fact that his teammates voted him a captain, and everybody knows what his leadership chops are like. But I think the contrast, and D'Amico Ryans pointed this out, Tank Dell pointed this out in his media session. Hell, CJ himself pointed it out when he did media today. Tank, CJ, and Stefon Diggs all did media. We'll get to that in just a second. But this time a year ago, D'Amico Ryans wouldn't even name CJ the starter. He didn't name CJ the starter until like a week and a half before the season. So that he's now obviously the unquestioned leader of this team, but he's acting like it. He's acting like a vet at this training camp. He is holding guys accountable. He is, when guys make mistakes, he's hammering home the need to clean things up. He's just, he was already fine last year in terms of just his overall, the way he carried himself as a rookie. But at 22 years old now, he is unquestionably the leader of this franchise, and he's acting like it. He's carrying himself like it. So that was really, really cool to see. That's number one. Number two, we finally got Stefon Diggs at the podium. And I will say he was really, really good. I enjoyed Stefon Diggs at the podium. I look forward to many, many more podiums with Stefon Diggs. He said that he was asked, ultimately, after a few questions, he was asked about his time in Buffalo and how it ended. I believe Cody Stutes asked him that question. How does he internalize the way the outside world looks at him, the diva qualities, the way things end, the way things have ended in both places he's been prior to Houston. And I thought Diggs had a good answer to it. He basically said he doesn't take personal things that people who don't know him say about him. I don't know how entirely true that is, but I thought it was a good answer. I also noticed that Stefon Diggs really doesn't mind saying the word shit a lot. He must have said shit a half dozen times in his press conference. I don't know how they do it in Buffalo, Stefon, or in Minnesota, but here you clean that up, mister. You clean up that language. If for no other reason, it makes it really hard for us to play your press conferences on the radio without having to censor them and edit them. Make it easier on us, Stefon. Just use shoot and poop and feces and things like that instead of shit. Okay. This isn't a podcast. This isn't the Utopia fucking football podcast where you can just curse whatever you want to. In all seriousness, my other big thing was, why did it take so long for him to meet with the media? The way it kept getting pushed out, there was no press conference after he got traded here. And then we knew he'd been in the building, but no press conference. Finally, today we get a press conference and he was outstanding. And I don't know if there were questions that Stefon himself or the Texans were concerned about him answering. I thought he did a great job. I thought he was really good. It's very evident that his teammates are taking an extreme liking to him. Tank Dell basically called him his big brother today, and said that he's been bringing incredible leadership to that wide receiver room. Again, these are things that were said about Stefon Diggs in the beginning of other places he's been, like Minnesota and Buffalo. For me, just get a year out of Diggs, and then we'll go from there. But Diggs clearly likes it here. Like, he really, at one point in the press conference, he just smiled and said, "I'm really happy." So I think it's a nice testament to Diggs himself that he's adapting to his new environment so quickly. I don't know that we necessarily found out if he's getting around the traffic around town better than he had been. He was very vocal about that on social media. But I think it's a real testament to the flip in the culture with the Texans. They've taken a guy like Stefon Diggs and so rapidly not only incorporated him into the locker room and on the team, but really made him like being here. Says a lot about D'Amico Ryans and CJ Stroud, and I think the type of guys that Nick Caserio has sought out to fill this locker room with. So that was really, really cool to see. As far as players out at practice go, it's hard at minicamp and really any non-padded practice to have any sort of solid takes on position groups that are built on contact, blocking, tackling, things like that. So a lot of the takes that you're going to get are on how quarterbacks are throwing the ball, how receivers are catching the ball, and how defensive backs and linebackers are covering wide receivers and tight ends. So I will say that all of the talk about John Mechie being more explosive, I think, is true. Now, I don't know if it's been exaggerated, and we'll learn more once the Texans are going against teams that aren't the Texans. But John Mechie has looked really, really good in camp at the practices I've been to. I went to a couple OTAs, and I was at the practice today, and everybody's been saying it. And he does. He definitely looks like he's been able to take his athletic game and turn it up a notch, which would make sense given the fact that he's coming off, a year removed from cancer treatment. So Mechie has looked really good. And think about that. Think about if you've got a wide receiver room where you've already got Nico, who got paid. You've got Stefon Diggs, who's an all-pro. You got Tank Dell, who I think there's a chance Tank has the biggest year out of any of these guys when you consider how much space there's going to be for him to get open. And then you add John Mechie to the mix. Like, if Mechie actually starts to achieve to the level of the 44th overall pick in his draft class, which is what he was, that's an incredible fourth option. You really now have some depth where if something happens to one of those big three, you can slide Mechie in there and as an offense overall, not skip a beat. I mean, obviously Mechie is not Nico or Tank or Stefon Diggs, but there's no reason the offense can't continue to hum without, you lose one of those guys, replace him with Mechie, if Mechie is who he's been looking like in camp, you should be able to still score some points. So that's been pretty cool. Tank Dell, I know a lot of you ask about Tank Dell. I get all the mailbag questions about Tank. How's Tank look? How's this? Tank met with the media today, and he was great. And he talked in pretty great detail about the shooting that the wound he suffered in the shootings back in Florida in a month and a half ago, whatever it was. But he looks great at practice. He you wouldn't know that he broke his leg last year. You wouldn't know he got shot in the leg just a few weeks back. So Tank looks really, really good. His receiving core is going to be dynamite, and you add Dalton Schultz in there, and the things that Joe Mixon can do out of the backfield. I think Dameon Pierce has started to kind of look the part a little bit more of a, back to being a viable NFL running back as opposed to the end of last year where he couldn't get on the field. So Mechie and Dell, to me, in the wide receiver room, those were big ones. And Diggs is just getting open all day long. The last observation from minicamp, we'll go to the other side of the ball at cornerback. And Kamari Lassiter looks the part. He looks like not just be a contributor. I think he's got a legitimate shot at starting at cornerback. We'll see. But they were playing him out there opposite Stingley at that other outside cornerback position. We'll see how it goes. It's a long camp. It's a long preseason. But at the very least, athletically, the knock on Lassiter had been that he was a little slower than the top tier cornerbacks. He ran a 4.6 something in the 40 at the combine. He looks plenty fast to me. He runs just fine. He was covering Tank Dell on a play where both guys were running, north-south vertical, and he was keeping up with Tank. So I think it could be there's a good chance Kamari Lassiter is one of those guys that the stopwatch speed doesn't match the speed that you see once a guy puts pads on and a jersey and all that other stuff. So those are my takeaways from minicamp. But it's all it did was get me excited for training camp getting here. It's going to be a really fun year with this team. All right, with that said, let's get into the mailbag. Again, HOU mailbag at gmail.com. I'm just going to leave that email address down there. And I've got a handful of questions here that we'll get to. Let's start with Henry. Henry, first-time emailer. Justin Jefferson got a new deal. 4 years, $140 million, $110 million guaranteed. How much credit does Nick Caserio deserve in getting Nico's deal done? Nico Collins, that is. I don't know. I don't know that I directly connect the two. To me, Justin Jefferson was always going to break the bank. He was always going to get $35 million. And I don't know that Nico was going to see Justin Jefferson get $35 million and then walk into Nick Caserio's office or have Drew Rosenhaus do it, his agent, and say, I need $32 million. I think Nico knows what his body of work has been so far. It's not Nico's fault entirely that his numbers didn't match up with other receivers' numbers in 2021 and 2022. That was a horrible Texans team, but Nico was also banged up those 2 years. And for, fair or not, that gets put on you as a player when you're injury prone like that. I think Nico proved this past season he can stay healthy for the most part for an entire season. The Texans paid him like that. So I don't know that Justin Jefferson's new deal. I do think a deal like Jalen Waddle's new deal, and I know Jalen Waddle has put up bigger numbers than Nico Collins. I think Nico skill-wise is in the neighborhood with guys like Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle. They're different skill sets, but I think the overall package of how dangerous a player it is, maybe doing it a little differently than those guys, I think he matches up with those guys. I think he's better than Amon-Ra St. Brown, who got $30 million a year. So I think, getting it done, I think before the Jalen Waddle deal might fit that a little bit more. Like if Jalen Waddle had got his $28 million a year, which is what he got, then maybe Nico agitates for a little bit more. Ultimately, I think Nico probably landed on a spot that makes a lot of sense for his productivity, what he means to this offense. He wants to be here. So I think that's all good. So I don't know. I think Nick deserves credit just for he deserves credit for a couple of things. One, drafting Nico Collins, which he did. He traded up to get Nico Collins in 2021. So Nick deserves credit for that. And then I think just getting Nico at a price that, independent of what all these other guys are signing for, it feels like a really good deal for the Texans for what Nico Collins is and is going to be and who he is as a person and a teammate and a Texan. So that's where I think the credit comes in. I don't think there's credit. I don't think the Justin Jefferson deal factors in really at all with Nico. Henry also asked, when do the Texans start to deal with some of these issues that other teams are dealing with in terms of players getting deals that reset the market, like Justin Jefferson. We saw another one. This is me adding this, not Henry. Christian McCaffrey got an extension today, $19 million a year in new money for 2 more years tacked on to the end of his deal. So that's crazy. Like a running back getting $19 million. It feels like Jefferson and McCaffrey are just so far out in their own universe when it comes to those positions. So do we have any issues coming up when it comes to that with the Texans? I would say that, to me, Seth and I actually had this conversation on the show today about which guys on the Texans could eventually, which guys on the Texans have contracts coming up, extensions coming up in the next couple of years that are going to reset the market. You know, that could turn into something with a staring contest, like we're seeing with a lot of these receivers right now with CeeDee Lamb and Jamar Chase and so forth. I think CJ Stroud is going to be the highest paid player in football in 2 years. So I don't even know that one's a difficult negotiation. It's a quarterback. So whatever the top contract is, if in 2 years it's still Joe Burrow at $55 million, CJ gets 57 or 60. I think CJ is ultimately going to be a $60 million a year quarterback. I think Will Anderson has the potential to be a market resetting edge rusher. He's got work to do, obviously, and I feel stronger about CJ than I do Will, but he is in that conversation. I think Derek Stingley Jr., if he has another healthy season this year, like he was the second half of last year, if he has a full season in 2024, like he had a half season in 2023, then Stingley is going to be in the conversation for a contract extension after this season. So I don't know that any of these things are necessarily problems. I'm guessing Nick Caserio and D'Amico Ryans are beginning to plan for this type of stuff. I know for a fact that Nick looks at the team in sort of 2-year windows. So maybe the CJ and Will contracts are still something that's a little off into the distance for him. But these are good problems to have. Having so many good players, you got to figure out which ones you're going to pay top dollar to. CJ's a lock. Will is a lock. Stingley is close to a lock. Probably Laramie Tunsil, who this would be his 4th contract, I think. But I could see him, if Laramie's still playing at a high level in a couple of years, I could see him resetting the tackle market again, which right now is at $28 million for Penei Sewell in Detroit. So, again, these are good issues, man. When you got players that are in these types of conversations, you're putting a pretty good team together. All right. Remember the emailer last week, Eating Well? Turns out that Eating Well has a real name. And his real name is France, just like the country. And he says, pretty odd, I know, but my name is France, which is cool. Now that and France asks, now that the new uniforms have been out for a little while, have your opinions changed versus your initial reaction? No, not at all. My initial reaction was very positive towards the new uniforms. So that's, yeah, I don't know, France, if you knew that was what my reaction was, but my reaction to the uniforms was the 2 alternate uniforms, the Color Rush with the H-Town blue in it and the Battle Red, head-to-toe Battle Red with the horns on the helmet. I like those 2 the best. It bums me out that they can only wear them 3 times a year. I think that stinks. I would love to see the red one become the regular uniform. The other 2 uniforms are fine. To me, they're just like tweaked variations of the existing blue, dark blue and white uniforms. And so they're fine. I think my overall reaction to the uniforms is 2 that I love and 2 that are okay. Like, I don't hate any of them. I know one of the big criticisms of the regular uniforms, particularly the white jersey, was that it looks too much like the Atlanta Falcons. I think that was more the pictures that got leaked and the colors in the pictures as opposed to the actual real color with the human eye. But no, my opinions are the same, and I can't wait to see them in these games. I cannot wait to see the new uniforms on the field. I loved seeing the stuff the team was putting out with CJ and Stefon Diggs in the new uniforms this week. I thought that was really cool. Neither of those guys were able to make it to the initial unveiling. So to see them really kind of loving the uniforms and seeing the stuff the Texans are putting out with those guys in them is really, really cool. So, France, appreciate that. Appreciate you revealing your real name. Appreciate these kind words. You and Seth do an incredible job covering the Texans. We hope to see you guys there to experience the atmosphere and apparently incredible food scene. We will take all recommendations. My wife heard your podcast and said, we got to get to Houston. We'll pack snacks you can only find here. help me out, Eating Well. I forget where you were from. I don't have your old email. I know your name is France, but I can't remember. Help me out. If you're listening to this, email me. Remind me where you're from. I know you're from overseas somewhere. I apologize. But if you do make it over here for a game, make sure to come by the pregame show and say hello. All right, my man Joe Q is back in. Thank you for the email, France. Joe Q says, I want to laud your self-awareness. This is him addressing me, of your Brock Purdy skepticism as day threeism, a form of unthinking discrimination. Okay. So let me pause right there. Yeah, I do. I am skeptical about Brock Purdy, despite the numbers, despite the deep playoff runs. There is just something about plugging a guy into that Shanahan offense and the fact that he is surrounded by so many elite weapons that I'm not sure that Purdy, if you plunked him down in a bunch of other situations, obviously wouldn't be as productive because, some of that, and that's not even Brock Purdy's fault. Like it's not his fault. He's got these great weapons, and to his credit, he's deploying them properly other than overtime of the Super Bowl. So Joe points out my day threeism. I guess that's my form of quarterback racism. 3 questions surrounding this. Number one, as you watched Dynasty is the New England Patriots 10-part documentary. And given that you grew up in New England, do you recall if you were part of the crowd that screamed, "What the fuck?" when Bill stuck with Brady after Drew Bledsoe came back healthy in 2001? That was an early 2000s form of day threeism. I will say this. I wasn't living in New England at the time. I didn't grow up a Patriots fan. And I was living in Houston when that all went down. So I was probably, I'm guessing I probably was. I don't remember, Joe, to be honest with you. I'm guessing as just an observer without any skin in the game, I probably was having a little day threeism. Because let's keep in mind, like Brady was not great back then in 2001. That was a great defensive team and they had a running game and Brady did some good things. But, I watched Dynasty and was reminded that Brady was, overachieving the normal 6th round pick, but he wasn't necessarily the reason those teams were winning football games back in 2001. Number 2, do you affirm or deny that Brock Purdy is in an extremely small club in terms of his achievement in his first 2 seasons? Even if you think Shanahan is doing it with scheme and elite skill players, can you agree the win-loss and passing stats are spectacular? Yes, they are. He's won a lot of games, put up some really good numbers. Now comes the test. Number 3. Okay, the real test of the depth of your day threeism, Sean. Assume Roger Goodell makes an arbitrary decision that the Texans have to trade CJ Stroud in exchange for 2 number 1 picks and one of the following NFL starting quarterbacks. Which one do you want? And Joe Q is reading my mind. So my first question is, well, where are the 2 number 1 picks? Like, whose picks are they? What team is this? He says, let's just say they're both, let's just put them both in the middle of the first round, 16 and 17. So these are average first round picks. So I'm trading CJ Stroud for 2 firsts and which of these quarterbacks? I have to pick one. Okay. Caleb Williams, Bryce Young. I'm going to go down the list and kind of gauntlet this thing. So Caleb Williams is first and then Bryce Young. I would take Caleb Williams over Bryce Young. Caleb Williams or Trevor Lawrence. I would take Caleb Williams over Trevor Lawrence. Caleb Williams or Kyler Murray. I would take Caleb Williams over Kyler Murray. Caleb Williams over Baker Mayfield. I would take Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams over Jared Goff. These are all former number 1 overall picks, by the way. You can tell. I see what you're doing, Joe Q. Caleb Williams over Jared Goff. Now that's a tricky one. You Jared Goff, veteran guy, productive guy, flunk him on the Texans now, and you can probably, because you got to think about winning a Super Bowl with this roster. I'm not a huge Jared Goff fan, but I can't ignore what he's done in Detroit. I mean, he had them really close to getting to a Super Bowl. So I'd probably, for the purposes of 2024, take Jared Goff, but for future purposes, take Caleb Williams. I don't know if I'm waffling there. And then he's got Brock Purdy on this list. I would take Caleb Williams over Brock Purdy just based on the potential. As far as Goff or Purdy, oh boy. I got to stick with what got me here. Day threeism. Give me Jared Goff. It's not a choice that I like making, but I have to admit who I am. I can't be a hypocrite and and all of a sudden just flip. I know you're trying to sell me, Joe Q, but unfortunately, like many very prejudiced people out there where it's ingrained in them, perhaps through their upbringing or genetics, as such is day threeism with me. It's just how I was brought up to doubt the 6th and 7th round picks. That's a great question. I don't know if that's too complicated for the podcast. I don't know how easy or hard that was for you all to follow if you're listening to this, but that was a fun question on paper for me. All right, let's get to a couple more. Ryan and the Shug. If you had to compare the Texans' free agent signings or the guys they re-signed to contracts the Texans have given and how they've unfolded, how would you compare the following recent deals? Okay, I don't know if I completely follow this question. Because he says, for example, Joe Mixon and gives back. You know what, Ryan and the Shug? Sorry. This is, I don't know if it's the wording or how you're asking, but it's not podcast friendly. And I appreciate you saying at the end, always a big fan of the podcast. This feels more like I might need to meet you for a beer and you and I need to sit down with a piece of paper and go over this because I'm not sure the wording of this question and how you lay it out. I kind of like the direction you're going with it, but I'm going to table this one until you clarify for me further. I wouldn't normally do that for people. I wouldn't normally read a question that turns into a dead question, but Ryan and the Shug, I know you're a big fan of the podcast. I need more clarity on where you're going with this because nobody likes making contract comparisons across different eras of Texan football more than your boy. But I may need you to come up with the comps. Like I see here for Joe Mixon, you came up with benchmarks of David Johnson and what they gave up and paid him and Arian Foster. I don't have the time to go research what the comps are for these other 4 players that you've got here. So I may need more input from you on this one. Now, your Astros question, I'm happy to answer. If we compared these contracts to another sports league like MLB, what recent contracts and free agent signings would these be comparable to? So what NFL contract is Jose Abreu, Michael Brantley, and Justin Verlander? See, again, I don't have the time. I don't have the brain power to think this through. Ryan, I need more input from you on this. I need you to come up with the comps and then have me judge your comps. How about that? All right. 2 more. Ryan, I appreciate the question and the kind words, but I think you know where I'm going. Charles, can we all agree that we just need to let Nick Caserio cook? We signed Nico to roughly a 3-year, $72 million deal. As of this email, Justin Jefferson signed a $35 million deal. It's fair to say if we would have waited, the amount per year would be a lot more. And then Charles has a follow-up question. Again, I addressed this earlier in the mailbag. I disagree. I don't think Justin Jefferson's contract would have had any effect on Nico Collins. I think those two are operating in different neighborhoods, Charles. Charles's other question, outside of our top 3 wideouts, who's the next wide receiver that could make a gigantic leap this offseason? Mechie or Hutchinson? To me, right now, it's clearly John Mechie, based on the practices that I've seen. It's clearly John Mechie. I don't know that he will, but you're asking which is most likely, could make a giant leap this offseason. Mechie looks different in a good way. Last one. Dennis asks, we need an iconic 34 for the Texans, just one, so that we can complete the Houston number 34 legacy. Yeah, the number 34 in Texans history, I'm pulling it up right now. It's not the most sexy number out there. Who's the best 34 in the history of the Texans? Here they are in alphabetical order. Dominique Barber, A.J. Boye. I will point out, though, A.J. Boye became A.J. Boye the Beast in number 21, not number 34. Tyler Ervin, Troy Hairston, Von Hutchins, Tywan Jones, Stacey Mack, Vernon Moranci, John Reed, and Michael Tyson. I would give it to one of 2 people. Michael Tyson, because he's got a badass name, even though he was only on the Texans for a season, and Tywan Jones on the strength of his catch and run in overtime to help beat the Bills in the playoff game. Other than that, boy, this is a lost universe for the number 34. You know what? Dennis, I'm with you. Let's give 34 to somebody that can make 34 great again for Houston. Okay. All right. Appreciate everybody emailing in. houmailbag@gmail.com. houmailbag@gmail.com. Again, subscribe, rate, review the podcast. We've got a couple more mini camp practices and then we're off into summer. So the mailbag questions we can go haywire with the mailbag questions. They can be Astros, they can be Texans, they can be anything. WWE, if you're a WWE fan, send me a WWE question. I'll answer them on here if they're good and if they're inclusive kind of questions that I think even non-wrestling fans would enjoy the answer. But we'll wrap this one up. Big thanks to Anthony Irwin, my producer, who gets the podcast out to you guys each and every episode. And to all of you for listening, I'll be back on Thursday for another episode of the Utopia Football Podcast. I'm Sean Pendergast. Have a great day, everybody.